We're heading into the last full week of campaigning, or 1 week to go, 8 days, in fact, before a June 23rd Brexit referendum. And with the Leave campaign picking up steam, look who's finally front and center on the campaign trail. Jeremy Corbyn's always been a bit ambivalent about Europe. Hailing from the left of the party, his misgivings over the EU mirror those of the hard left in France, Germany, Ireland, and elsewhere. So was his Tuesday pitch to Remain convincing? We'll ask our panel. More moderate backers of the EU have been quick to air their own caveats, particularly over what's been the political third rail in this campaign, immigration. Polls suggest that many MPs from working-class districts are discovering constituents who associate the EU with uncontrolled borders and economic migrants. Those lawmakers not only fear a Brexit, but voters will perhaps, they fear, desert their party for the anti-immigrant UKIP. The story of a populist movement that takes votes first from the right, then from the left, has a familiar ring to those who've tracked the rise of France's far-right National Front. Could Britain one day follow suit? And when it comes to Europe, what's really in the interest of those working-class voters? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the UK left's laborious Remain campaign. With us, journalist and blogger Maya Goodfellow. Thank you for joining us from London. We're also in the company of Florence Fauché, who teaches at Sciences Po, the French Political Science Institute, and the author of The New Labour, Change and Reform Under Blair and Brown. Thank you for being with us. And France 24 Europe editor Yves Irvine joins us. Thank you, Yves. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter. The hashtag F24debate. In one poll, the Leave campaign built a 7-point lead. Others are tighter, but still with momentum swinging in favor of a Brexit. The week began with the Remain camp rolling out Gordon Brown, the former Labour Prime Minister, who in 2014 helped swing the tide against independence for Scotland with his vigorous campaigning. Florence Fauché, what was your reaction when you saw Gordon Brown on the campaign trail?
Well, I think he did a clip that was very good, very well paced and quite strong. I think it's important to remember, as you said, that in 2014 he basically saved the referendum for the Scottish independence.
He saved it?
Absolutely. I think without Labour, Scotland would have been independent probably. And also what happened then is that there was a backlash against the Scottish Labour Party, which explains its fall after the referendum and the disastrous election for them in 2015.
Maya Goodfellow, what does it say? Because there was a lot of criticism before the week began, saying we haven't seen much of Labour on the campaign trail.
Yeah, I think that there is an argument that the Tories have kind of dominated the debate. But I think in the past couple of days, we have seen with Gordon Brown, but now Jeremy Corbyn, kind of putting out different cases, which I think is important, because Gordon Brown speaks to a certain kind of perhaps more enthusiastic supporter of the EU, and Jeremy Corbyn's more tempered, less enthusiastic stance, I think, will speak to a lot of people who aren't sure. And I think his scepticism about the EU and EU institutions will go down well with a lot of people. So although he's been criticised for not kind of being gung-ho about the EU, I think that will actually do the campaign some favours.
All right, you mentioned Jeremy Corbyn. He made his first pro-Remain speech in mid-April, which was late since the campaign actually began in February. But now he's really stepped into the limelight. It was Tuesday in London in the company of Labour leaders and trade union representatives.
We are making the case everywhere that staying in the European Union gives us the opportunity to defend and extend the rights of people at work, gives us the jobs that we need and the exports that we must fulfil as a country to the rest of Europe. Therefore, we are making the strongest case we can for the good of the ordinary people of this country to vote to remain, to give us that voice, to try and improve rights and justice in this country and all across Europe.
Yves Irvine, is that a convincing pro-Remain pitch you're hearing there?
Well, we'll have to wait another few days perhaps to see if we get that reaction from Labour voters. But already, surveys as late as May were saying that half of Labour voters weren't actually sure which side their party stood on the debate. So clearly, there has been this call for Jeremy Corbyn, for Labour ministers to step up to it. As you were saying, this delicate balance for the Labour Party to be seen literally standing side by side with the Conservative Party. They did get punished for that back in 2014 after the Scottish referendum. There's that, and there's also, for Jeremy Corbyn himself, in the past he was outspoken Eurosceptic in the 1970s. He's changed a lot. I have, however, spoke to other former Labour ministers who were part of Tony Blair's government. And part of their hesitation is also they feel, well, David Cameron got himself into this mess all by himself. He's now coming out as being very pro-EU, but when he made the gamble in 2013, he thought this would be an easy referendum to pass. So there's a slight bit of stand back and, let him sort out his own mess.
Yeah, because just remind our viewers here, this EU referendum was a campaign promise before the last general election.
Indeed, for some time, the three main parties really in the UK had promised to bring the UK's EU membership once again to a referendum. And when David Cameron came to power in 2010, he said, well, if I'm re-elected, when it came to general elections, he said, if I'm re-elected, this long promise to put the vote to the people will happen. He did win, but UKIP in that election got something like 4 million votes. So he couldn't forget the promise he had made to the people. So he had to do as he is doing and hold that referendum before 2017.
At last week's edition of The Economist ran The Economist, very pro-Remain in its editorials. Well, it ran an editorial that was brutal for Jeremy Corbyn. It was called Jeremy Corbyn Saboteur. His pro-EU speeches are litanies of complaints about the union. Voters should back Remain, he says, because the Conservatives would not negotiate the right sort of Brexit. On June 2nd, he declared Treasury warnings about the consequences of leaving as hysterical hype and myth-making. And we heard him in Parliament today, Maya Goodfellow, say that he won't accept any austerity should Brexit pass. Is that a fair cop, the Economist editorial?
Well, I think what a lot of the debate that kind of led up to before the referendum date was announced, and I spoke to a lot of people who are pro-EU and a lot of people on the left as well, who were so sure that Remain would win. It was hands down. It was going to be a no problem victory. And I think what that Economist article kind of speaks to is this idea that everyone will be won over by this really enthusiastic pro-EU argument. And I think Jeremy Corbyn is right to take the stance that he is, because no one would believe him if he all of a sudden came out supporting the EU, 10 out of 10. I think he said on Friday on a comedy chat show that he was around 7 out of 10 in support for the EU. And I think that is the right line to be taking, because there are people who are not sure. And I think speaking to their worries and their concerns, as he's doing, is the right approach to take if you're going to try and win them over.
But it's so late in the day. He makes his speech there 9 days before the actual vote.
I think that's slightly unfair. As you said, that back in April, I was there when he gave that speech, and he was saying very much the same kinds of things. And he's held back a bit, yes, maybe because the Tories have dominated the discussion and in a way, been allowed to tear themselves apart. But you have to also remember that Alan Johnson has been involved in the Labour In campaign, and he has been out on the campaign trail as well. So it's not all down to Jeremy Corbyn. There are different Labour players playing important roles, I think. And Jeremy Corbyn hasn't shirked his responsibility, which it's an odd kind of assumption or assertion that a lot of people are trying to make.
Maya, Jeremy Corbyn comes from the left wing of the Labour Party. Are there young people inside the Labour Party who are from that wing of the party who are going to vote yes or no that you've personally spoken to?
Yeah, so actually, interestingly, after the speech that Jeremy Corbyn gave in April, and which I was at, it was in central London, on my way out, I heard two young people having a discussion, one of whom was still convinced he was going to be voting out, but another who said after that speech, and seeing that Jeremy Corbyn is behind this campaign, he is now going to be voting in after being sceptical. So I think there are young people that he specifically is talking to. And if you look back at last year's Labour leadership contest, when Jeremy Corbyn, the groundswell of support was huge. And it wasn't just young people, but there were a lot of young people coming out in support for him because they'd never heard the kind of ideas that he was floating and suggesting, and the status quo that he was challenging. They'd never heard that kind of politics. So I think that he really does speak to those young people and enthuse them to that they can change the EU, which I think is the core message of his campaign.
They can change the EU, but it'll be a question of whether they vote in or out. France Fauché, you wrote this book on the new Labour and how the Labour Party changed under Blair and Brown, but it seems like, listening to Maya here, that's changed again now. And what is that? How does that bode for that vote?
Well, the party indeed has changed a great deal since the Blair years. I mean, one has to remember that indeed Blair was probably the strongest advocate of the place of the UK in the EU in those days. What is interesting is that in a way he has failed to convert his country. He has failed to convert his Chancellor then, Gordon Brown, to the euro. He's failed to actually speak really and inform the British public about the EU. And we have a situation now where the British voters are asked to vote in a referendum where we find out that they are the least informed on what the EU is, what it does. They've been fed for years and years misinformation from everywhere, and particularly also during this campaign. But you have had in the past governments from the Labour Party as well as the Conservatives claiming whenever they had a piece of legislation that they needed to introduce and that was expected to be unpopular, blaming the EU. From the shape of bananas to the number of bananas on a bunch that could be sold in supermarket, the size of toilet rolls and so on. So all these arguments have, over the years, over 40 years, really contributed to create a British public that is
But hang
not
on,
interested.
hang on. But the French left here in France is the same way that Jeremy Corbyn is. They have the same misgivings about the EU.
That's true, and there are arguments, especially as, in a way, one could argue the Blairites have promoted the UK agenda on the EU and contributed to promote neoliberal perspectives in terms of economic policies in particular. The left, and in particular the extreme left, has grown more sceptical. Now, if we look back in time, in the 70s and 80s, the Labour left the Labour Party was opposed to the EU, and it's only when, with the reform of the law, with the introduction of the social charter, that the Labour Party converted to.
Why was it opposed to the EU then?
Because it was seen as another means of promoting capitalism, and it was opposed to most of these policies.
When you look at the lay of the land across the 28, it's the same argument coming from the hard left in other places like Germany, Ireland.
In terms of Euroscepticism,
yeah.
Well, it's actually, I think that's something the extreme parties on both sides play into, the extreme left and the extreme right. Any of the standard traditional parties, if you like, are seeing that opening because it is that political play in it to a certain extent of Brussels bashing. That's an easy argument for a lot of parties. The difference, I guess, is for the left wing, they're more, that radical left wing has seen a more strong stance because of what's happened really in austerity with the European Union, notably in Ireland. Sinn Féin, they got more backing the more Ireland saw itself as a good student, putting in, what the EU told it to do, and still suffering under austerity measures. When they saw what happened in Greece, I think that also impacted the Labour Party in the UK. That, for a lot of people, was seen as this power from beyond national sovereignty, cracking down and putting pain on a certain level of people, whereas the right wing, their issues are more that sovereignty and nationalistic identity.
All right, in the House of Commons this Wednesday, we heard the Conservative Prime Minister, David Cameron, reaching across the aisle with a nod to Jeremy Corbyn.
Very few times when he and I are on the same side of an argument. And this must say to people watching back at home that when you've got the leader of the Labour Party, and indeed almost all of the Labour Party, a Conservative government, the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, the official Ulster Unionists, and the Scottish National Party, all saying we have huge disagreements, but on this vital issue for the future of our country, the best option for Britain is to vote to remain in a reformed European Union, that really says something.
I was just listening there to David Cameron, and before that, Eve Irvine. And let me put this to you, Maya Goodfellow, because we're in a year of where insurgents are doing really well, be it in the United States. We know they're going to do well here in France next year with the far right. And there's the idea that if you have David Cameron singing the praises of Jeremy Corbyn, that it just looks like it's the political establishment, and that a vote for Remain is a vote for the establishment.
So I think this is really important, and this is why Jeremy Corbyn has refused to share a platform with David Cameron. It's something that the Labour Party were doing at the Scottish referendum, and I think it was not the cause of their collapse in Scotland, but it certainly didn't do them any favours. So I think David Cameron can say that all he likes, but the fact that Jeremy Corbyn is time and again coming out and critiquing the EU in a way that David Cameron would never dare do, I think that sets them apart. So any worry about it being this kind of establishment fix from Jeremy Corbyn's point of view is kind of brushed to one side. But there is still that worry. I think a lot of people still do see Remain with David Cameron at the forefront of it, at least, as something as a vote for the establishment and a vote for things the way they are, despite the fact that both Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage are very much part of the establishment.
Florence Fauché?
It's important to remember the role of the media in all this. I mean, the campaign has been dominated by the Conservatives, by the split within the Conservative Party. We have Boris Johnson and Michael Gove on one side, and then Cameron and Osborne on the other. But it's largely because it's been such a boon for the media. I mean, the infighting within the Tory party and the questions about the leadership, what happens the day after. I mean, basically, the fact that Cameron's seat, the seat he was trying to save in 2013, is really, liking to disappear under him in a week's time. I think that's really what we should remember. And it's a very similar situation to what is happening in the US. The triumph of Trump is largely linked to the coverage, the incredible media coverage he has received.
The incredible media coverage. Is that changing, Maya, in the final week?
What, in the UK?
Yeah.
Well, I think so. Now we do have this issue of immigration kind of coming to the fore from the Labour Party, which introduces another dimension to this conversation. I think we still do have this problem with, like, you're right, the media obsession with kind of infighting within parties as opposed to looking at the actual facts of the debate. We haven't had many real facts being discussed in the UK, and I think a lot of this is built on misinformation. And you do talk to people, most people I talk to, in fact, don't understand how the EU works. They don't even know how many immigrants live in this country from the EU. So I think there are these big problems that the media is kind of complicit with.
All right, you mentioned that issue of immigration and how Labour Party stands on it. We're going to talk about it when we come back here in the France 24 debate.